I plan to talk to Hans von Spakovsky, who's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, but he wrote recently for Heritage about how the left is trying to use the idea of disparate impact. In other words, they try to say, when a certain set of rules is imposed on a group of Americans, that they have a different kind of impact on some people rather than others. The Obama administration used this to try to get rid of school discipline, and to a large extent, they were successful in doing that. Officials said that you can't have racial quotas in school discipline, or that you have to have racial quotas. It's not only illegal, but it's unjustified, and it hurts the well-behaved students and their teachers. And Hans, I've shared with my audience before where schools will say, we can't discipline kids because when we discipline them under the rules, even doing it in a colorblind way, we end up disciplining some groups based on skin color and ethnicity more than we do others. And but if that's the result of evenly using discipline, isn't that the way that the discipline ought to be applied?
Yes, it should. And there's all kinds of studies out there that show that different students misbehave differently due to a whole wide variety of different circumstances, including conditions in their homes, their neighborhoods, their communities. And the idea that there's something wrong if you're applying a neutral policy and you're applying it equally to all students, that somehow you're doing something wrong if it turns out that kids of one race are disciplined more than others. I mean, that's just absurd. That happens because nothing's perfectly in line with our ratios in the population. If they were, then we could certainly sue the National Basketball Association, because the proportion of black players there is certainly higher than the proportion of black Americans in the general population.
Well, I'll give you one that goes even closer to discipline. If you ask, and I've asked about a bunch of different states, in most of the states, I find that 90% of the people locked up in prison are men, and only 10% of the population that's locked up in prison is women. And you say, well, there must be a hardcore bias in favor of women and against men. And people would, I think, reasonably say, if they were sane and you were taking that insane line, they'd say, no, men commit more crimes than women, and when we apply the laws equally, we end up with a 9-to-1 split. One woman in prison for every 9 men in prison. And people accept that's it, that men can behave badly, and women do not tend to behave badly in the same fashion, or at least in a fashion that lands you in prison.
I mean, that is most certainly true. We have more men in prison because they're more violent and they're more aggressive than the average man is more violent and more aggressive than the average woman. That doesn't mean that women don't commit violent acts. They do, but unfortunately, thousands of years of human behavior show that men do commit more crimes and are more the aggressors. The other problem with these racial quotas like this and discipline is it really hurts students, because if you're not disciplining particular students for disruptive behavior because of their race and you're leaving them in class, then you are creating a terrible environment for all the well-behaving students, and you're encouraging even more disruptive behavior by those students who are misbehaving, which may make the problems they face in their life much worse later on.
I think even parents see this. If you have a family with a small child, 2 small children, one male and one female, and about the same age, I'd be willing to bet that an awful lot of parents say, well, Johnny always gets up to more mischief than Jane does, and so we end up having to call him on that. But if you all of a sudden said, well, we have to do this equally. So, if Jane gets in trouble once a week and Johnny gets in trouble 5 times a week, we can only punish Johnny as often as we punish Jane. So we're going to punish Jane once a week, but she isn't doing much. And when Johnny goes out and pulls some kind of nonsense, breaks a vase or, throws a ball through the window or whatever, we're only going to punish him once a week because we only punish his sister once a week. When you set that standard, Johnny realizes, I can get away with murder. Well, not quite murder, but he can get away with a lot more than Jane can. Jane's going to see the disparity. She can say, why does Johnny get away with all this stuff? And Johnny's going to see it saying, I'm being allowed to get away with all this stuff because I'm a boy. Now, if that's the way you handle it, you're teaching everybody a bad example. Even the kids who don't get in trouble will see the difference and say, why does he get away with it? Well, because he's Hispanic or because he's black. And you say, so he gets away with stuff because of his skin color? How is that right?
Yeah, it's not. And, what's even worse is students they know what's going on. They see what's going on, and they're being taught by teachers and administrators that it's okay to treat people differently based on their race. And that is the worst lesson in the world that we could be giving students across the country.
So to what extent can the Trump administration reverse this, and how much has Betsy DeVos been able to do to try to take these crazy rules out of the public schools?
Well, they moved very quickly. These rules were put in place in a lot of schools due to a guidance letter that the Obama administration sent out in 2014. They, in essence, said, you want to keep getting federal money, then you better have a racial quota system for your discipline in the schools. The Trump administration withdrew that guidance letter. Many schools then went back to their old ways, but unfortunately, too many other schools kept these policies in place. And what needs to happen is parents whose children are victims of this kind of policy in schools that have kept these in place, they need to be prepared to sue and file civil rights lawsuits against schools that do that to stop them from engaging in that kind of behavior.
The only thing is, Hans, and this gets to a legal issue, is you usually get to see when you sue when you've been wronged. So I guess if you had Johnny who goes to school and other kids are not being disciplined, but many of these schools seem to have given up discipline altogether. They said when we use the policies, discipline policies, we end up disciplining too many black students, too many Hispanic students, not as many whites, certainly not as many Asian kids. So we'll just stop doing it altogether. In that case, Johnny can't sue for being disciplined where somebody else was not disciplined, because he's not being disciplined either. So how do you bring the legal case to, for what the school isn't doing rather than what they are doing?
Well, you don't necessarily have to file a lawsuit. You can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education, and they can, if they investigate, they can sanction school districts for doing that. In the situation you're talking about, I would actually file a complaint with the Department of Education because I would say by failing to discipline disruptive students, this school is basically establishing an environment that is so dysfunctional and so disruptive that my child can't get an education. And that's the kind of complaint to make about that.
Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation. Hans, it's always a pleasure.